Her name is Hobby. She was born into slavery in a country called Mauritania, not in 1850, not in a black and white photograph. Right now, today. She says she was always the first to wake up and the last to go to sleep, working for the family that calls itself her masters. This isn't history. This is happening while you watch this video. So here's the question this video is actually going to answer. If slavery ended, when exactly did it end? Who ended it? And why, right now, are there still an estimated 46 million people living in some form of slavery around the world? The story you were taught has a clean ending. The real one doesn't. Let's find out why. For most of us, the story of how slavery ended sounds simple. A group of good men in Britain looked at what their country was doing, and they couldn't live with it anymore. William Wilberforce stood in Parliament, year after year, refusing to give up. The Quakers organized. Ordinary people signed petitions by the hundreds of thousands. And eventually, in 1807, Britain banned the slave trade. It's a story with a hero, a villain, and a happy ending. Wilberforce spent decades fighting a system that made powerful men rich. And he kept losing. And he kept coming back. In 1833, Britain finally abolished slavery across its entire empire. To most people, that's the whole story. Good triumphed over evil. The moral arc of history bent and slavery lost. And here's the thing, that story is true. Wilberforce was real. The Quakers were real. In 1787, a small group of them founded the Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade, and within a year they'd collected petitions signed by tens of thousands of ordinary people who had nothing personally to gain from any of it. They just believed it was wrong. It wasn't only petitions. Working class families across Britain gave up sugar entirely in 1792. In one of the largest consumer boycotts in history, because sugar was grown by enslaved hands in the Caribbean. They did it again in the 1820s during the final push to abolish slavery across the empire. It cost them. Sugar was one of the few small comforts available to poor families. There were horror stories that shocked the public into action too. In 1781, the crew of a slave ship called the Zong threw over 130 living, chained human beings into the ocean, then tried to claim an insurance payout for lost cargo. When the case became public, it didn't just outrage abolitionists. It forced ordinary British people to confront exactly what they were funding. So, by every measure, this was a real grassroots moral movement, one of the first in history to organize entirely around the suffering of people its members would never meet. But here's what that story leaves out. It leaves out timing. It leaves out money. It leaves out the people who were actually enslaved and what they did for their own freedom long before London ever voted. The question isn't whether the moral story is true. It's whether it's the whole truth, or the version that was easiest for everyone else to see. Because the year Britain finally acted wasn't random. And the men who voted for it weren't only motivated by conscience. To understand why 1807 and not 50 years earlier, we have to follow something else entirely. Let's go back to Britain in the early 1800s and look at who was actually gaining power. A new class was rising. Factory owners, industrialists, men who made their money from wages, not whips. They didn't own plantations. They didn't need enslaved labor. And slowly, without most of them even planning it, their interests started pulling in the opposite direction from the old plantation economy. This new class had a problem with slavery, and it wasn't only about conscience. Slave-grown sugar and cotton were tied to an old aristocracy. Landowners who had run Britain's economy and its politics for generations. Every pound spent defending slavery was a pound spent defending Britain's oldest, most entrenched power. Attacking slavery wasn't just morality, it was a direct hit on their political rivals. Look at who actually sat in Parliament at the time. The old guard, the landed nobility, with plantation money running through their family fortunes, held enormous sway in the House of Lords. The rising merchant and industrial class had to fight for influence in the Commons. Ending slavery wasn't just freeing enslaved people in the Caribbean. It was a vote that quietly shifted power at home. It was also Africa itself. British merchants weren't just done with slavery. They wanted something to replace it. Palm oil, cotton, timber, goods they could sell factories back home. But as long as European buyers kept purchasing enslaved people, African traders had little reason to switch. Ending the slave trade wasn't only about freeing people, it was about clearing the way for a different kind of profit. One of Britain's biggest companies at the time, Lloyd's of London, had insured almost every major slave trading voyage crossing the Atlantic. But by the early 1800s, profits from that industry were dropping, while profits from wage labor manufacturing were climbing fast. The people with the loudest political voice in Britain increasingly had their money somewhere else. Slavery was becoming, for them, a liability rather than an asset. And this is the argument historian Eric Williams made decades later in his book, Capitalism and Slavery. His claim was blunt. Slavery wasn't abolished the moment it became wrong. It was abolished once it stopped being useful. Once the men with real power in Britain had more to gain from a free labor economy than a slave one. Morality, in his view, arrived conveniently late. It's an uncomfortable idea because it doesn't erase Wilberforce, or the Quakers, or the petitions, or the families who gave up sugar for decades out of genuine conviction. It just asks you to hold two things at once. Good people fought sincerely against slavery. And at the exact same time, an entire economic class was realizing slavery no longer served their interests. Both things were happening in the same rooms, in the same years. And that raises an uncomfortable question for anyone who wants a clean hero story. If the timing lines up this well between when it stopped paying and when it became illegal, was morality really driving the vote? Or was it riding alongside something else and getting all the credit afterward? Here's where the story gets more complicated and honestly, more interesting. Not every historian buys the economic argument. One of the strongest challenges to Eric Williams came from historian Seymour Drescher in a book with a blunt title, Econicide. His argument was simple. If slavery was truly dying out economically, the numbers should show it clearly. He said they don't. Drescher went back through the actual trade records, and what he found didn't fit the economic story cleanly. In the years right before Britain abolished the slave trade, the Caribbean plantation economy wasn't collapsing. Sugar was still profitable and investors were still making money. By Drescher's reading, Britain didn't abandon slavery because it stopped paying. It abandoned slavery while it was still paying a very different story. Think about what that actually means, if he's right. It means British lawmakers voted against their own country's short-term economic interest. That's rare in politics in any century. It doesn't happen by accident, and it's not easily explained by a handful of industrialists quietly shifting their portfolios. Something else has to be filling that gap. Something that made people act against their own immediate profit. So now you have two serious historians looking at the same country, the same decade, and landing in opposite places. Williams says money moved first and morality followed conveniently behind it. Drescher says the numbers don't support that. The trade was still healthy when it was banned, which means the moral pressure must have carried more real weight than the economic story gives it credit for. Neither one of these is a conspiracy theory. Both are built on real trade data, real parliamentary votes, real shipping records from the period. This isn't two people disagreeing on opinion. It's two people looking at the same numbers and drawing different conclusions about what they mean. That's what real historical dispute actually looks like, and it rarely wraps up into a tidy conclusion. This matters because it's tempting to pick whichever version feels more satisfying and just stop there. The cynical version feels smart and modern. The moral version feels comforting and simple. But the honest answer, sitting between them, is messier. The economic case is real, and the hole in the economic case is also real. Something doesn't fully add up if you explain 1807 with money alone, which leaves an open question, and it's the right one to ask next. If it wasn't purely the money, and the purely moral story leaves out too much, what actually forced the issue? Not in Parliament, not in a pamphlet, but on the ground, in the plantations themselves, where the people actually living under this system had already started deciding they weren't waiting for permission. In 1791, on the French colony of Saint-Domingue, enslaved people did something no one in Europe thought was possible. In the middle of the night, across the northern plains of the colony, they rose up. Not a riot, not a scattered protest, but a coordinated uprising against the single most profitable slave colony on earth. Within days, plantations across the region were in flames. Leading that uprising was a man named Toussaint Louverture, a formerly enslaved man who became one of the most skilled military strategists of his era. He fought the French, he fought the Spanish, he fought the British, who tried to seize the colony for themselves while it was in chaos. He outmaneuvered all three of the era's major imperial powers, using an army built from people who had been enslaved weeks earlier. Napoleon Bonaparte, at the height of his power in Europe, sent tens of thousands of his best soldiers to crush the uprising and restore slavery on the island. It was one of the largest military expeditions France had ever launched. And it failed. Disease, guerrilla warfare, and the sheer determination of an army fighting for its own survival broke Napoleon's forces in a way European armies rarely were. By 1804, after 13 years of war, the people of Saint-Domingue didn't just win their freedom. They founded Haiti, the first nation in the Americas to permanently abolish slavery, and the first nation in modern history founded by a successful revolution of enslaved people. Not granted from above, not voted on in a distant parliament, taken by force by the very people the system was built to own. Historian Sylvain Diouf put it plainly. Without that revolt, France's own revolution likely never got around to abolishing slavery when it did. The uprising in Haiti didn't just free one colony. It forced the question onto every other slave-holding power watching from across the ocean. Suddenly, abolition wasn't a philosophical debate happening in comfortable rooms in London and Paris. It was a live, terrifying threat. And Haiti wasn't the only place this happened. Across the Caribbean and the Americas, uprisings and rebellions kept the pressure constant for decades. Barbados in 1816, Demerara in 1823, Jamaica in 1831. Each one cost enslavers money, soldiers, and control. Each one made the entire system more expensive, more dangerous, and harder to defend politically back home. Freedom wasn't just argued for. It was costly to deny. In Britain itself, some of the loudest, most effective voices against slavery weren't white reformers. They were formerly enslaved men. Olaudah Equiano wrote one of the most widely read personal accounts of slavery of his era. He used his own life story and his own reading of the Bible to argue that the entire system was a betrayal of Christianity's core teachings. Another formerly enslaved man, Otoba Kugawano, published his own account calling not just for reform, but for the complete abolition of slavery everywhere it existed. These weren't background figures. Equiano toured Britain, speaking directly to crowds, selling out printings of his book, becoming one of the most recognized public voices in the entire abolitionist movement, a formerly enslaved African man, addressing Free Britons directly. This is the part of the story that gets quietly dropped. Not because it's a secret, but because it's inconvenient. It's easier to tell a story where freedom is given. It's harder to tell one where the people in chains looked at the most powerful empires on earth, decided they weren't waiting, and simply took what was theirs, while also arguing for it, in print, in public. Here in the United States, the story runs on a completely different timeline. Britain banned its slave trade in 1807. The U.S. technically banned the importation of enslaved people in 1808, but barely enforced it. Enslaved people already in the country, and their children, and their children's children, remained enslaved for another 57 years. The ban on importing people did almost nothing for people already owned. For decades, the U.S. Navy ran its own version of Britain's anti-slaving patrols, chasing down illegal slave ships along the African coast and in the Atlantic. But enforcement was inconsistent and deeply political. Southern states depended on slavery for their entire economy. Northern states increasingly didn't. That divide didn't get resolved by petitions or moral debate. It eventually got resolved by the deadliest war in American history. Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 freed enslaved people only in Confederate states still in rebellion, a wartime military tool as much as a moral statement. It didn't touch slavery in border states that had stayed loyal to the Union. Slavery in America wasn't fully abolished until the 13th Amendment passed in 1865, months after the Civil War itself finally ended. So even within one country, you can see the same tension playing out. Was the Civil War fought to end slavery? Or was slavery's end a consequence of a war fought over economic and political control of the country, Lincoln himself said publicly that his primary goal was preserving the Union, not necessarily freeing enslaved people, though by the war's end, both had become impossible to separate. And formerly enslaved Americans didn't simply wait for that amendment either. Hundreds of thousands of black men enlisted in the Union Army once allowed to, fighting directly for their own freedom and the freedom of others still enslaved. Just like in Haiti, just like across the Caribbean, the pattern holds. Freedom arrived fastest wherever enslaved and formerly enslaved people put their own bodies directly into the fight. Now here's the part most documentaries skip entirely, because it doesn't fit neatly into a hero and villain story. Africa wasn't just the place people were taken from. It was full of kings, traders, and empires making their own decisions, some resisting the slave trade from the very beginning, others building entire economies on top of it, long before ships from Europe ever arrived. Take the Kingdom of Benin. Back in 1514, its ruler, Oba Ozalua, sent an official complaint to Portugal, protesting what Portuguese traders were doing along his coastline. 2 years later, in 1516, Benin banned the export of male slaves outright. They kept trading with Europe, ivory, pepper, cotton cloth, just not people. That's a king drawing a hard line nearly 3 centuries before Britain did. In West Central Africa, Queen Nzinga of Ndongo and Matamba spent decades resisting Portuguese slave trading expansion directly, through diplomacy when it worked, and through open warfare when it didn't. She wasn't a passive figure watching her people get taken. She was a head of state, actively fighting a foreign trading power encroaching on her territory for the better part of her 40-year reign. But that's only half the picture. In the Asante Kingdom, when the British later tried to force abolition, they didn't meet gratitude. They met war. Slavery wasn't a foreign import there. It was woven into the entire economy, the entire power structure of one of West Africa's most powerful states. Asante chiefs said it plainly in their own words at the time. Without enslaved labor, their entire state couldn't function. No one to carry goods, staff households, work the gold mines, or sustain the armies that protected their independence. Abolition, from where they stood, wasn't liberation. It was a direct attack on the foundation of their entire society, and they fought it for years. So, this is the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath the whole story. There were African rulers who resisted the slave trade before Europe ever asked them to. And there were African rulers who went to war to keep it running. Both of those things are true in the same era on the same continent. This video is going to be honest. It can't hand the moral high ground to one side and the blame to the other. Let's go back to where we started. Hobby, born into slavery in Mauritania, not in 1850, not in a black and white photograph, but alive today. She was never freed by a proclamation. No army marched in to end it for her, and she is not alone. Right now, an estimated 149,000 people are still enslaved in that country alone. Mauritania didn't outlaw slavery until 1981, making it the last country on earth to do so, nearly 120 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. It didn't make owning another human being a crime until 2007. That's not ancient history. That's within a lot of our parents' lifetimes. Even with the law on the books, enslavement never actually stopped there. It just stopped being official. Zoom out further, and it gets harder to look away from. Right now, today, an estimated 46 million people around the world are living in some form of modern slavery. Roughly 25 million of those are trapped in forced labor. Others are held through forced marriage, debt bondage, or human trafficking. Different names, same core reality. A person owned, controlled, or trapped by another person for profit. India carries the highest raw number of anyone on Earth, with an estimated 11 million people affected by some form of modern slavery. Partly a matter of sheer population size, and partly a reflection of how many different forms enslavement can take once you look past the word slave itself and start counting bonded labor, forced marriage, and trafficking as what they actually are. So, did slavery end because good men in Britain finally found their conscience? Partly. Did it end because it stopped making economic sense for the people in power? Partly, and also, provably, according to Drescher's own numbers, not entirely. Did it end because enslaved people in Haiti, in America, and beyond simply stopped waiting for permission and took their freedom by force? More than most of us were ever taught, slavery didn't end with one idea, one hero, or one specific action. It cracked under pressure from every direction at once. Money, morality, rebellion, and even then it never fully ended. Some of it just went quiet, moved underground, and kept running in the places the world stopped watching closely enough to notice. The real question isn't who gets the credit for ending it. It's why, in some corners of the world, corners we rarely put on camera, it was never actually allowed to end at all, and why 46 million people are still waiting for their own version of 1804 or 1833 or 1865 that so far nobody has come to deliver.